What's up, everyone? Welcome back to my studio. My name is Michael Taylor, and thank you for joining me for another video today. Today I'm going to be asking a very interesting question, and that question is, what is money? Now, the reason I want to cover this is because I plan to cover cryptocurrency and Bitcoin in the future, but in order to understand what those two things are trying to accomplish, we first need to understand what money is. So I'm going to kind of walk you through the evolution of money and kind of describe to you what we used as money in the past and what we use as money today. So in the very beginning, we began with trading and bartering. So you literally used whatever you had as money. So if you were a farmer that raised chickens, then that was your form of money. If you were a farmer that picked berries, then yes, berries were your form of money. And the reason trading and bartering doesn't exist today is because it's very complicated. So if you wanted to trade your chicken in for a goat, you would have to understand the equivalent value of chicken based off of goat. Same with chicken based off of berries, chicken based off of a spear, or fixing your wagon. You would have to establish the ratio for each of those things. And that's also a problem because people value things differently. So if you are a farmer and you don't necessarily hunt all the time, then you have no need for spears. Or bow and arrows and things like that. So that's why that process kind of died out. As humans began to evolve, we discovered using things such as semi-precious materials. So if you are a mountain community, you may use things like seashells, or if you lived on the beach, you may use things like quartz crystals. So for example, if you're in the mountains, seashells are very rare. So they're also very easy to transport. So that gives them value. If they're rare and less abundant, then it's harder to find and it's hard to duplicate that form of money. Well, the reason that's a problem is because theoretically, if you lived in the mountain and you began to explore outside of your community and perhaps there was a beach nearby, then you could take a bucket down to the beach, fill it up with seashells, and take it back to your community. Well, you would be rich, obviously, but you would begin to oversaturate the market. You would begin to bring back more seashells than people actually wanted because they weren't rare anymore. And this is what's called inflation. So that's kind of why that process died out. After that, humans began to use precious metals, so things like gold and silver. Well, gold is a great form of money because it is easily distinguishable. People know what gold is. People can check whether or not gold is real or fake. And it's a good store of value because it lasts a long time, right? It doesn't wither away or dissolve, and it retains what it is. The reason gold doesn't make good money is because it's very heavy and it's very insecure. So for instance, if you wanted to exchange your gold for a piece of property in Minnesota, say you lived in California and you wanted to buy property in Minnesota, you'd have to take all of your gold and transport it to Minnesota, where you could then trade it for your property. Well, not only is that very hard to do and very time consuming, but it's also very insecure because along your way, someone could come by, club you upside the head, and take all of your gold. Then you'd be out of luck. So that's kind of the problem with gold. Well, the next step that humans took is we created something called banks. And what a bank allowed us to do is it allowed us to store our money and in exchange for a piece of paper or a bank certified note, right? And this was unique because now instead of having to carry around all this gold, you just had a bank certified note that verified how much gold you put into the bank. And the bank was, secure, they had guards, they had a vault, and they would make sure that your gold was safe. And at any point in time, you could take your certificate back to the bank and get back your gold. Well, banks quickly realized what kind of power they had because no one really knew how much gold they had in their vaults, right? People like civilians aren't capable of just going back into the vaults and checking to make sure that gold is still there. So what banks began to do is they began to issue more money than the amount of gold that they had in reserves. So they could artificially create gold, right, by issuing the money without having the gold, and then they could give that to people. So that's how like loans and things would work. But the problem with that is that if everyone in that community rushed to the bank and wanted their gold out for whatever reason, the bank wouldn't have enough gold to give everyone, and the people would realize that bank was a fraud, and they would some people would be able to get their gold out, but eventually the bank would run out of gold, and the people that are still actively trying to get their gold out, and the bank says, we don't have any more gold, then they're just shit out of luck. They don't have any way of getting their value back, and this is a problem. So the current situation that we face is that in 1913, the U.S. was basically the Federal Reserve Bank was established in the U.S. And this bank is essentially the bank of all the other banks. It is the one that issues all of the money. It regulates all of the banks. It is basically in control of our economy. But it's funny because this bank is actually not regulated or in control by anyone in the U.S. So the government doesn't have any regulation on this bank. The people, the citizens of America have no way of stepping in and regulating this bank. It is a central bank that is completely separated from America. It is a central bank. And basically, these kind of banks are all around the world, and this is how the central banks, the elites of the world, are controlling the monetary supply. And this is important because these are the people that determine how much money is in circulation. So in 1930s, Ronald Reagan came up with the idea that we don't need to have gold back the US dollar anymore. And this is significant because rather than having your $1 US worth X amount of gold, your $1 US is now ambiguous. It is determined by the Federal Reserve Bank, this bank that doesn't really have America's interest at heart. So this is very scary because what it allowed them to do is it allowed them to create an infinite supply of money because they don't need to have the gold necessary to back money that they're putting into circulation, right? And this brings us back to the problem of inflation. So now they're just pumping the economy full of US dollars, and they just continue to pump it. They continue to make more money, and what that winds up doing is it winds up depleting the value of each US dollar. So sure, we might have billions and trillions of dollars in circulation, might sound great, but equivalently their value is probably only worth $500 million. And it continues to deflate. It continues to depreciate in value. In fact, in the past 10 years, the US dollar has depreciated 50%. So what that means is, if you had $10,000 10 years ago and you wanted to buy a car, but you could do so, but instead of buying it right then and there, you decided you wanted to save that $10,000 in hopes to buy a better car in 10 years. Well, as the 10 years progress, your $10,000 would be the same amount. You would still have $10,000, but it would now only be worth $5,000. So you would need double that in order to buy the car. And this is continuing to happen. It's continuing to deflate. And this is a problem because Americans live under the assumption that we need to save for a better life tomorrow, right? We need to save our money. We need to put it into 401ks, into pension funds, into savings accounts. We need to invest it. When in fact, it's actually better if you just spent the money that you got right then and there, buying that car, because that car is going to be more valuable in 10 years than your actual investment, your money. And, it's really frustrating because people live under this assumption and people want to save for a better life, but they can't get that because the value of their money is constantly being deflated, and they can't climb out of that debt hole. They're constantly buying things that they want and need, but they can never pay for it. They're just constantly trying to get more money that's less valuable. And this is the current situation we're in. this is why we now live in a debt-based system. So the number one asset for America is actually student loan debt. This is the most valuable asset that America has to offer. And that is because there's so many people in debt, and there's all these contracts that force people to pay back the debt that they've accrued, that this is now the asset that banks and the government are starting to trade. So rather than the certificate of gold that they used to trade, it is now a certificate of debt. So that is student loan debt, that is housing mortgages, and debt on your car. You know, anytime you take out a loan to pay for something, you're promising that you're going to pay back that loan, right? And there's consequences if you don't. And so now these companies are using that contract, that certificate, to exchange value. And this is a problem because it forces people to live in this constant state of fear, in this constant state of debt. Because if we were to ever pay back all of our debt collectively as a nation, if we could just pay it all off, the entire system would implode. Nothing would have value anymore. Our number one asset as a country would be depleted. We would all be broke, basically. So we can't pay it back. If we paid it back, then we would be broke. It's a very silly system. So we need a solution. And that's ultimately where Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies come in, because these technologies allow us to store our value, store our money into something that isn't going to inflate to astronomical highs. There's literally a cap on the amount of Bitcoin that will ever be created. It allows people to become their own bank. It allows people to be in charge of their own money, and they don't have to ask their bank to use their money. They don't have to pay an exorbitant amount of fees to get their money out of their pension, right? My mom, for instance, wants to, if she were to take her pension money out, that she's been saving over 40 years, if she wanted to just take that money out, they would cut the amount by 40% just because of fees, and because they don't actually have the money. They would have to generate this money somehow, some way. And so that's kind of what Bitcoin allows. It allows people to store their money. It allows them to have a way to understand that it's not going to inflate and that it's very secure. And basically, I'll get into that in another video, but you should definitely look into this technology. It's very important. This is the future, and I highly encourage you guys to do some research. And if you're interested, then please check out Andreas Antonopoulos. He's the guy that has taught me so much about this field, and he's like a savant in the cryptocurrency sphere, so I'll link a video down below. But check out some of his videos and do some research. But that's pretty much it for today. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.